In the beginning there was only a river, a patch of hills, and a legend. The legend told of two brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned as infants and left to die by the Tiber River. Saved and nourished by a she-wolf, they grew to manhood and dreamed of founding a city. But fate turned violent. In a quarrel over where the new city should stand, Romulus struck his own brother dead. From blood, Rome was born. It was 753 BCE, and a city that would one day rule the known world began with the cry of a wolf and the tragedy of fratricide. Of course, history is more practical than myth. Rome's earliest settlers were farmers and herders, drawn to the fertile soil near the Tiber and the strategic hills that provided defense. They were Latins, mingling with Etruscans from the north and Greeks from the south. The city's birth was not in isolation but at a crossroads of cultures. From this mixture, Rome developed its toughness, its pragmatism, and its hunger for greatness. For centuries, Rome was ruled by kings. These monarchs were not without achievement. They drained marshes, built temples, and organized the community into tribes and clans. But kingship carried the shadow of tyranny. In 509 BCE, Rome cast off its last king, Tarquin the Proud, and swore never again to be ruled by one man. In his place, the people established a republic. A residential publica, a public thing, a government of laws and citizens. This was the true beginning of Rome's extraordinary story. The Roman Republic was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. At its heart was the Senate, a council of elders drawn from the aristocracy, the patricians. Beside them stood the consuls, two men elected each year to command armies and preside over the state. No man could hold absolute power for long. Even in times of dire crisis, when a dictator was appointed, his term was limited to 6 months. This balance of power was Rome's strength and its fragility. The Republic was not born equal. The patricians, wealthy landowners, dominated politics and society. The plebeians, the common people, were excluded from the highest offices. But the plebeians were not content to remain silent. Over generations, they fought a slow and determined struggle known as the conflict of the orders. They seceded from the city, refused military service, and demanded representation. Gradually, concessions were won. The right to elect their own magistrates, the tribunes whose power to veto protected the people from injustice. By the mid-4th century BCE, plebeians could hold office, marry into patrician families, and even sit in the Senate. Rome had created a republic that, though still unequal, was more inclusive than any monarchy before it. This political experiment thrived because it reflected Rome's deepest values. The Romans prized discipline, duty, and above all, the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. Tradition was their anchor. Change came slowly, but it came inevitably as each generation adjusted the republic to meet new challenges. And challenges came quickly. Rome was not alone in Italy. Rival Latin towns, warlike hill tribes, and powerful Etruscan cities surrounded it. To the south lay the Greek colonies, wealthy and advanced. To survive, Rome had to fight. And fight it did. Through war after war, it subdued its neighbors. Sometimes Rome destroyed its enemies, but more often it offered them a deal. Defeat brought not annihilation but alliance. Conquered peoples might keep their local governments, but they must supply soldiers to Rome. This system of alliances multiplied Rome's strength. By the 4th century BCE, the city could call upon tens of thousands of troops, far more than any single rival. The Roman legion, disciplined and adaptable, became the terror of Italy. One of Rome's greatest tests came in 390 BCE, when a band of Gauls swept down from the north and captured the city itself. Rome was sacked, its temples burned, its citizens slaughtered or enslaved. For a lesser people, this might have been the end. For Rome, it was the beginning of a lifelong obsession with security. Never again would they allow their city to be vulnerable. Never again would they be satisfied with walls alone. The best defense, the Romans believed, was conquest. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had become the master of Italy. From the Po Valley in the north to the Greek cities of the south, all fell under Roman control. But victory carried a consequence. Beyond Italy's shores lay powers far greater, and Rome was about to step onto a world stage it could not easily leave. Across the sea in North Africa stood Carthage, rich, ancient, and armed with a navy that ruled the Mediterranean. Between Rome and Carthage, a clash was inevitable, and that clash would transform the Republic forever. The year was 264 BCE. Rome had conquered the Italian peninsula, but beyond its borders loomed an adversary unlike any it had faced before. Carthage, founded centuries earlier by Phoenician traders, had grown into a maritime superpower. Its wealth flowed from trade across the Mediterranean, its cities sparkled with prosperity, and its fleets commanded the seas. If Rome was strong on land, Carthage was unchallenged at sea. The stage was set for a rivalry that would last over a century, the Punic Wars. The First Punic War began not over ideology or hatred, but over a small dispute in Sicily. What began as a local skirmish expanded into a struggle between two titans. Rome, a land power with almost no naval experience, faced Carthage, a master of the waves. But the Romans were nothing if not adaptable. They built a fleet from scratch, copied Carthaginian ship designs, and added their own invention, the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into infantry fights, where Roman discipline could prevail. After 23 years of grinding conflict, Rome emerged victorious. Carthage was forced to surrender Sicily, pay reparations, and watch its dominance wane. But Carthage was not finished. In Spain, a new leader arose, Hannibal Barca, the son of a general who had fought Rome before. From childhood, Hannibal had sworn eternal hatred of the Romans. In 218 BCE he set out to fulfill that vow. With an army of men, horses, and war elephants, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He crossed the Alps, braving snow, avalanches, and hostile tribes, to bring war into Italy itself. For over a decade, Hannibal ravaged the Italian countryside. His victories were astonishing. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, he annihilated Roman armies many times his size. At Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal encircled and destroyed an army of perhaps 80,000 men. It was one of the greatest tactical feats in history, and for Rome, a catastrophe beyond imagining. Thousands died, senators and generals among them. For a moment, it seemed Rome itself might fall. But Rome did not fall. The Republic refused to surrender. While Hannibal marched across Italy, Rome avoided direct confrontation, adopting a strategy of attrition. Led by generals like Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer, they harassed Hannibal's forces, cut off his supplies, and wore him down. At the same time, Rome struck at Carthaginian holdings elsewhere in Spain and North Africa. Finally, in 202 BCE at the Battle of Zama, the Roman general Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal once and for all. Carthage was crushed, its empire dismantled, its power broken. Rome now stood as the unrivaled master of the Western Mediterranean. Yet Rome was not satisfied. A third war came decades later in which Carthage, weakened but still alive, was finally obliterated. In 146 BCE, after a brutal siege, Roman soldiers stormed Carthage, destroyed the city brick by brick, and enslaved its population. The ancient rival was no more. Rome salted the earth, legend says, so nothing would grow again. Whether myth or truth, the message was clear. Carthage was gone and Rome reigned supreme. But Rome's triumph was double-edged. Victory brought wealth beyond measure. Grain from Sicily, treasure from Spain, slaves from Greece and Africa, all poured into the Republic. Senators grew rich, generals amassed personal armies, and the old balance of the Republic began to crack. Expansion, once a source of strength, now became a source of division. In the 2nd century BCE, Rome turned east, conquering Macedonia, Greece, and eventually the remains of Alexander's empire. Greek culture flowed into Rome, shaping its art, literature, and philosophy. Romans read Homer, built temples like the Greeks, and learned rhetoric from Greek teachers. Yet even as Rome grew more cultured, its society grew more unstable. The influx of wealth widened the gap between rich and poor. Patricians seized land, forcing small farmers into poverty. The poor crowded into Rome, unemployed and restless, dependent on handouts. Reformers arose like the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They sought to redistribute land, aid the poor, and curb the power of the aristocracy. But the Senate resisted, and both brothers met violent ends. Their deaths marked a turning point. Political disagreement in Rome was no longer settled by debate, but by bloodshed. The Republic had tasted civil violence, and it would not be the last time. As the 1st century BCE unfolded, generals became the true power in Rome. Soldiers no longer fought for the Republic alone. They fought for their commanders who promised them land and spoils. Men like Marius, Sulla, and Pompey rose to prominence, wielding their armies like political weapons. Civil wars erupted. Dictators seized power. Each victory weakened the old institutions of the Republic, and each defeat set the stage for the next strongman. And then came Julius Caesar. Brilliant, ambitious, and ruthless, Caesar conquered Gaul, crossing rivers and mountains to extend Rome's power to the Atlantic. His commentaries made him a household name, his victories made him beloved by his soldiers, and his ambition made him feared by the Senate. In 49 BCE, when ordered to disband his army, Caesar instead crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, an act of defiance that plunged Rome into civil war. "The die is cast," he declared, and so it was. Caesar triumphed over Pompey, his former ally, and became the master of Rome. In 44 BCE he was named dictator for life. But absolute power was too much for the heirs of the Republic to bear. On the Ides of March, a group of senators struck him down in the Senate chamber. "Et tu, Brute?" he is said to have cried as daggers pierced his flesh. The assassins hoped to save the Republic, but they only sealed its doom. In the chaos that followed, Caesar's heir Octavian rose to power. Clever, calculating, and patient, Octavian outmaneuvered his rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, he crushed their forces and emerged as Rome's undisputed ruler. In 27 BCE, the Senate granted him a new title, Augustus, the Revered One. He would not call himself king or dictator. Instead, he cloaked his power in republican tradition, holding the titles of consul, tribune, and imperator. But make no mistake, the Republic was dead. Rome had become an empire. With Augustus, Rome entered a new era. The Republic of citizen soldiers and annual magistrates had given way to the Principate, ruled by one man, supported by the Senate, the army, and the people. Augustus promised peace, stability, and prosperity, and he delivered. The empire stretched from Spain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Nile. For the first time, Rome ruled not just Italy but the world. The stage was set for the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace, prosperity, and cultural flowering. Rome had risen from a village on the Tiber to the capital of the greatest empire the world had ever known. But even in its golden age, the seeds of decline were already being sown. The first emperor, Augustus, promised Rome something it had long craved: peace. After a century of civil war, bloodshed, and chaos, the people yearned for stability. Augustus delivered it. Through careful reforms, shrewd politics, and strict discipline, he created what would become known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For more than 2 centuries, the empire would enjoy relative calm, prosperity, and security on a scale the ancient world had never known. Augustus restructured the army, ensuring loyalty not to rogue generals but to the state itself. He stationed legions along the empire's borders, on the Rhine, the Danube, the deserts of Syria, and the sands of Egypt. Inside the empire, soldiers were rarely needed, for law and order reigned. Roads, aqueducts, and cities spread across the provinces, binding together lands that once had been bitterly divided. A man could travel from Britain to Mesopotamia under the same laws, the same currency, and the same imperial authority. The Mediterranean, once a battleground of rival powers, became a Roman lake. The wealth of the empire flowed into Rome. From Egypt came grain to feed the masses. From Spain, silver and gold. From Africa, exotic animals for the amphitheaters. From Gaul, wine. From the east, silk, spices and precious stones. In return, Roman goods and Roman culture spread to the farthest provinces. Latin became the language of law and government. Roman baths, theaters, and temples appeared in cities from Britain to North Africa. The empire was not just a political unit, it was a cultural one, binding together diverse peoples under a shared identity. Romanitas, the essence of being Roman. Rome itself glittered as the jewel of the empire. Augustus boasted that he found the city of brick and left it of marble. And he was right. Monuments rose. The Forum of Augustus, the Era Pacis, great aqueducts carrying water across miles. Later emperors built even greater wonders. The Colosseum, vast baths, triumphal arches, and temples that dwarfed anything seen before. Rome was not merely a city, it was a statement of power, wealth, and civilization. Life in the empire varied dramatically between rich and poor. The elite lived in luxurious villas, adorned with mosaics and frescoes, their lives filled with banquets, slaves, and political intrigue. Senators and equestrians governed provinces, commanded armies, and controlled immense fortunes. The poor, meanwhile, crowded into insular, multi-story apartment buildings, often cramped, unsafe, and prone to fire. For them, survival was a daily struggle. To maintain order, emperors provided bread and staged circuses, free grain distributions, and spectacular entertainments. Gladiator games, chariot races, and theatrical shows kept the masses content, or at least distracted. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal would later write, were the tools of rule. Roman society was structured and hierarchical. At the top stood the emperor, the senate, and the aristocracy. Below them, citizens of the middle and lower classes, artisans, merchants, and farmers. Beneath even them were freedmen, former slaves who gained their freedom, and at the bottom, the vast population of enslaved people who worked in fields, mines, households, and workshops. Slavery was not just an institution in Rome, it was the backbone of the economy. Without the labor of millions of slaves, the empire could not function as it did. Yet Rome was more than politics and economics. It was a crucible of culture. Poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid composed works that would shape Western literature for centuries. Historians like Livy and Tacitus chronicled Rome's triumphs and its failings. Philosophers such as Seneca and Marcus Aurelius pondered the nature of virtue, duty, and the cosmos. Architecture and engineering flourished, aqueducts, bridges, and roads that endure to this day. Roman law developed principles that still underpin modern justice. Contracts, property rights, and the idea that citizens are equal before the law. The empire was not without its flaws, however. Beneath the surface of peace lay constant challenges. The succession of emperors was often uncertain. Augustus had carefully prepared his heir, but not all rulers were so wise. Some, like Tiberius, ruled capably but left behind suspicion and paranoia. Others, like Caligula and Nero, became infamous for cruelty, extravagance, and misrule. Each emperor shaped the empire in his own way, some strengthening it, others weakening it. The system had no clear rules for succession, and this instability would haunt Rome for centuries. Despite this, the empire endured. Under emperors like Trajan, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent. From the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Britain, from the sands of North Africa to the rivers of Germany, Rome's borders stretched farther than ever before. Trajan's conquests in Dacia, modern-day Romania, brought immense wealth in gold and cemented his reputation as one of Rome's greatest rulers. His successor, Hadrian, consolidated these gains, traveling the empire personally, inspecting defenses and building fortifications such as Hadrian's Wall in Britain. A reminder that the empire, though vast, was not without limits. Rome's strength lay in its adaptability. Conquered peoples were often granted citizenship, a revolutionary policy that turned subjects into Romans. A man from Gaul, Spain, or Syria could rise through the ranks to serve in the army, govern a province, or even enter the Senate. By 212 CE, the Emperor Caracalla extended citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, creating a truly universal Roman identity. It was this inclusiveness as much as military might that bound the empire together. Religion, too, was a unifying force. Romans worshipped a pantheon of gods: Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, and countless others. The imperial cult elevated emperors themselves to divine status, reinforcing their authority. Yet Rome was also tolerant of local traditions. Egyptians still revered Isis, Celts honored their deities, and Jews followed their ancient faith. But in the 1st century, a new religion began to spread quietly, Christianity. At first dismissed, then persecuted, it would one day transform the empire in ways no one could yet imagine. For now, though Rome stood at its height, its roads connected continents, its armies secured borders, its culture shaped generations. From humble beginnings on the banks of the Tiber, it had grown into the greatest empire the world had yet seen. The Pax Romana was the golden age of Rome, an age of peace, prosperity, and achievement. But like all golden ages, it could not last forever. Beneath the marble and splendor, cracks were forming. Economic strain, political instability, and external threats were gathering on the horizon. The empire that had risen so high would, in time, face its long and painful decline. Every empire, no matter how strong, carries within it the seeds of its own decline. For Rome, those seeds began to take root during the very height of its power. The Pax Romana had brought peace and prosperity, but maintaining such a vast empire came at an enormous cost. The cracks, though subtle at first, began to widen until they threatened the very survival of Rome itself. One of the greatest challenges was political instability. Rome's system of succession remained dangerously fragile. Unlike monarchies with clear hereditary rules, the Roman Empire had no established method for choosing the next ruler. Emperors might select heirs, adopt successors, or name generals, but every transition was uncertain. Ambition, greed, and the lure of power meant that civil wars erupted again and again. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Some lasted decades, others only months or even days. Corruption and excess also ate away at the empire from within. As wealth poured into Rome, so too did decadence. Senators sought luxury over duty. Officials grew rich through graft and exploitation. The once stern discipline of the Republic gave way to a culture of indulgence. Emperors themselves often embodied this decay. Caligula squandered the treasury on wild spectacles. Nero fiddled while Rome burned, or so legend says, and wasted resources on vanity projects. Domitian ruled with cruelty and paranoia, purging enemies real and imagined. While some emperors brought stability, too many left the empire weaker than they found it. The economy, once the lifeblood of the empire, also faltered. Rome's prosperity depended on constant expansion, on new lands to conquer, new peoples to tax, new resources to plunder. But expansion could not continue forever. By the 2nd century, Rome's frontiers had reached their natural limits. Beyond the Rhine and Danube lay fierce Germanic tribes. Beyond the deserts of Syria, the powerful Persian Empire. Beyond the sands of Africa, little but endless wilderness. With expansion stalled, the flow of wealth slowed. Heavy taxation weighed on peasants and landowners alike. Inflation soared as emperors devalued the currency, flooding the economy with cheapened silver coins to fund their expenses. Trade declined, poverty spread, and discontent simmered. The military, once Rome's greatest strength, also became a source of weakness. Rome's legions were still formidable, but their loyalty was increasingly to their generals rather than to the empire itself. Ambitious commanders used their armies to seize power, marching on Rome and declaring themselves emperor. Civil wars between rival claimants drained the empire's resources, leaving the borders vulnerable to attack. Meanwhile, the reliance on mercenaries and non-Roman recruits eroded the discipline that had once set the legions apart. Barbarians were no longer just at the gates, they were inside the ranks. Then came the crisis of the 3rd century, one of the darkest chapters in Rome's history. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire nearly collapsed under the weight of its troubles. In just 50 years, more than 20 emperors rose and fell, many of them killed in battle or assassinated by their own troops. Rival emperors ruled different parts of the empire at the same time, tearing Rome apart in civil strife. The once unified Mediterranean world fractured into pieces. External threats multiplied. Germanic tribes raided across the Rhine and Danube. The Goths swept into the Balkans, sacking cities and terrorizing the countryside. In the east, the Persian Sassanid Empire launched powerful invasions, capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian himself in 260 CE, an unprecedented humiliation. Pirates prowled the seas, cutting off trade. The very frontiers that Augustus had so carefully secured now crumbled. Inside the empire, disease and famine compounded the chaos. Plagues swept through cities, killing thousands. Crops failed, food grew scarce, and starvation followed. Cities shrank as people fled to the countryside. The once great urban centers of the empire began to wither. The social fabric of Rome was unraveling. For a moment, it seemed that the empire would collapse entirely. Rome's glory, built over centuries, stood on the edge of ruin. But even in its darkest hour, Rome showed a resilience that few could have imagined. Out of the chaos arose strong leaders who sought to restore stability. Emperors like Aurelian reconquered lost provinces, defeating enemies on multiple fronts and earning the title Restorer of the World. Reforms were attempted to stabilize the currency, reorganize the army, and strengthen the borders. Slowly, painfully, the empire clawed its way back from the abyss. Yet the crisis left deep scars. The empire was not what it had once been. The unity of the early empire was broken. The economy remained fragile. Trust in the political system was shattered. And lurking always on the horizon were the barbarian tribes, stronger now than ever, waiting for the moment to strike. The crisis of the 3rd century had shown that Rome was not invincible. The empire had survived, but it had changed. It was more militarized, more authoritarian, more desperate. The days of easy prosperity were gone. From this point forward, Rome would fight not to expand, but simply to endure. Rome had endured centuries of storms. Civil wars, invasions, plagues, all had threatened to destroy it, yet somehow it survived. But survival came at a cost. The empire was harder, less flexible, and more fragile. By the late 3rd century, reforms were desperately needed. And they came under the hands of two men, Diocletian and Constantine. In 284 CE, Diocletian rose to power, a soldier from humble origins who understood the chaos of his age. He sought not glory but order. His solution was radical. The empire was too vast for one man to govern, so he divided it. The Roman Empire became a tetrarchy, ruled by 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 juniors called Caesars, each governed a portion of the realm. The empire was split into east and west, each with its own capital, its own armies, its own administration. At first, this system brought stability. Frontiers were defended, revolts crushed, taxes collected more efficiently. But it also planted the seed of division. The East, with its wealthy cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople, flourished. The West, more rural and poorer, struggled to keep pace. Over time, the two halves would grow further apart, until they became different worlds altogether. Then came Constantine the Great, one of Rome's most transformative rulers. In 312 CE, he marched on Rome, facing his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. On the eve of battle, Constantine reportedly saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol. Against the odds, Constantine triumphed. He entered Rome as the sole ruler of the West and soon the entire empire. Constantine's reign marked a turning point. He embraced Christianity, once a persecuted faith, and gave it imperial support. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE legalized Christianity across the empire. Churches were built, bishops gained influence, and Christianity began its rise from a minority sect to the dominant religion of Europe. The old gods of Jupiter and Mars, worshipped for centuries, were gradually abandoned. Rome's spiritual heart was changing. But Constantine also made a decision of enormous consequence. He moved the capital. In 330 CE, he founded Constantinople on the site of Byzantium, a strategic city on the Bosporus Strait. Rich in trade and easily defended, Constantinople would become the jewel of the East. For the next 1,000 years, it would stand as the center of the Byzantine Empire. But for the West, it marked the beginning of decline. Rome itself was no longer the heart of the empire. The Eternal City was becoming a shadow of its former glory. By the 4th century, pressures from outside the empire intensified. The great migrations of peoples had begun. Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, pressed against Rome's borders. They were driven by hunger, land shortages, and perhaps most of all, the advance of a new terror, the Huns. Fierce horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns struck terror into Europe, pushing other tribes into Roman territory. In 378 CE, the crisis exploded at the Battle of Adrianople. The Goths, long mistreated by Roman officials, rose in rebellion. Emperor Valens marched to crush them, but he underestimated their strength. In a disastrous battle, the Roman army was annihilated and Valens himself was killed. For the first time, a Roman emperor had fallen to barbarian enemies in open battle. Adrianople was a warning. Rome was no longer invincible. Over the next century, wave after wave of invasions battered the empire. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, marched into Italy itself. In 410 CE they sacked Rome, the first time in 800 years that the Eternal City had fallen to a foreign enemy. The shock reverberated across the world. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem, wrote in despair, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Rome would recover, but only briefly. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa, seizing Carthage and cutting off Rome's grain supply. In 455 CE, they too sacked the city, looting treasures and carrying captives away. Meanwhile, Attila the Hun, called the Scourge of God, rampaged across Europe. Though he was eventually turned back, his invasions left devastation in their wake. The Western Empire, weakened by civil wars, economic collapse, and dependence on barbarian mercenaries, could no longer hold. By the mid-5th century, emperors in the West were emperors in name only, their power overshadowed by generals and barbarian kings. The East, wealthier and more secure, endured, but the West staggered toward collapse. The end came in 476 CE. The last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain Odoacer. The Roman Senate still sat, the city of Rome still stood, but the empire was gone. No legions marched in its defense. No emperors issued commands from its palaces. What had begun with Romulus, the legendary founder, ended with Romulus Augustulus, the last to wear the crown of the West. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, would continue for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, culture, and traditions. But the Western Roman Empire was no more. The greatest empire the world had ever seen, the empire that had conquered lands from Britain to Egypt, that had built roads, aqueducts, and monuments to rival the gods, had fallen. And yet Rome never truly died. Its legacy endures in ways both visible and invisible. Roman law influenced legal systems for centuries. Roman roads laid the foundation for Europe's trade routes. The Latin language became the root of the Romance tongues: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Roman architecture inspired generations of builders, from Renaissance cathedrals to modern capitals. Christianity, nurtured under Rome, became the dominant faith of Europe and beyond. Rome's story is not merely one of rise and fall. It is a story of transformation. From monarchy to republic, from republic to empire, from empire to collapse, Rome adapted, evolved, and left behind a world forever changed. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but Rome lives on, in our laws, our languages, our cities, and our imaginations.